2,000 years ago, a man running the most powerful empire on earth, surrounded by plague, war, and betrayal, had sharper focus than you do right now, sitting in a climate-controlled room with a fully charged phone. That is not an insult. That is a diagnosis. Why? Everything you've been told about focus is a sophisticated lie. There is a multi-billion-dollar industry built on the premise that your problem is a lack of technique. Buy the planner, download the app, follow the 5-step morning routine, and every year, millions of intelligent, driven people invest in these solutions, experience a brief window of improvement, and then watch their focus collapse again under the first real wave of pressure. The industry calls this a consistency problem. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. The real problem is architectural. You have been trying to build concentration on top of a cognitive foundation that was never designed for the environment you are operating in. And no productivity tool, no matter how elegantly engineered, can compensate for a broken foundation. This is not a motivational metaphor. It is a structural diagnosis, and the evidence for it has been sitting in one of the most studied texts in human history for nearly 2 millennia. In 161 AD, a man named Marcus Aurelius became emperor of Rome. He did not inherit a stable empire. He inherited a civilization under simultaneous assault from Germanic tribes on the northern frontier, a catastrophic plague that would eventually kill an estimated 5 million people, and a political apparatus riddled with corruption and conspiracy. By any modern standard of stress, Marcus Aurelius was operating at the absolute limit of human cognitive demand. And yet, the private journals he kept during this period, which we now call the Meditations, reveal a mind of extraordinary clarity, precision, and discipline. Not despite the chaos inside it. What was he doing that you are not? That question is not rhetorical. It has a specific, technical answer, and the answer will dismantle something you have probably believed about high performance since you first started taking it seriously. Because the operating system Marcus Aurelius ran was not built on willpower. It was not built on motivation. It was not built on any resource that depletes under pressure. It was built on a perceptual architecture so precise that chaos became, for a trained mind, simply data. The people who are dominating in your field right now, the ones who seem unreachable in their output and composure, are not working harder than you. They are not smarter than you. They are running a different cognitive operating system. And the blueprint for that system was written before the printing press existed, by a man who had more genuine pressure on his mind than any modern executive will ever face. If you have been following serious content about performance for more than a year, and no one has shown you this blueprint in its full operational depth, now you understand why your results have plateaus that feel impossible to break. Stay close, because what comes next dismantles the plateau permanently. What the Stoics actually built. Naming the invisible architecture. Most people who encounter Stoicism encounter a misrepresentation. The popular version presents it as a philosophy of endurance, a noble way to suffer without complaint. That interpretation is not just incomplete. It is the opposite of what the Stoics were engineering. And the distinction between those two readings is the difference between a person who survives pressure and a person who weaponizes it. The Stoics were cognitive architects. Their philosophical project was the systematic design of a mental operating system that could function at peak capacity regardless of external conditions. They were not interested in feeling better about difficult circumstances. They were interested in performing better because of them. That distinction carries enormous practical weight. The core mechanism of this system has a name: the dichotomy of control. Epictetus, a man who began his life as a slave and became one of the most influential thinkers in Roman history, articulated it with the precision that modern cognitive science has spent decades catching up to. Some things are within our power, he wrote: our judgments, our impulses, our desires, our aversions. Everything else is not within our power. Our bodies, our reputations, our positions, our possessions. This is not philosophy. This is a cognitive sorting algorithm. Think about what happens in your mind when a crisis lands. Every incoming piece of information, every worry, Every possible outcome floods your attention simultaneously. The concern you can act on right now and the concern you cannot influence for 6 months occupy the same mental bandwidth. They generate the same cortisol spike, demand the same prefrontal resources, and produce the same paralysis. The trained Stoic mind did not allow this contamination. Before any reaction was permitted, a triage question ran: does this fall within my field of control or outside it? The answer determined the entire cognitive routing of the response. What Epictetus was describing, translated into the vocabulary of modern neuroscience, is the deliberate activation of executive function before the amygdala hijack completes. He was building a mental circuit breaker, not to suppress the emotional response, which is both impossible and counterproductive, but to insert a measurable gap between stimulus and reaction. In that gap lives every high-performance decision you will ever make. Marcus Aurelius took this mechanism further with what he called the discipline of perception. He trained the ability to see events as they were. Stripped of the narrative layer the mind automatically applies. Not cold indifference, but clear observation. He described it as seeing the purple robe for what it truly is. Sheep's wool dyed with shellfish blood. Strip the status. See the material. Operate on reality, not on the story your nervous system tells you about reality. Now, a question worth sitting with: if you sorted everything demanding your attention right now in what you can act on directly and what you cannot, how much of your current cognitive load would dissolve? Share your honest answer. The conversation that emerges from that question in this community consistently generates more insight than the video itself. The mechanism is now named, but a mechanism on paper is not a system. What made the Stoics genuinely dangerous was how they operationalized this architecture into daily practice under real conditions. That is precisely where most accounts stop short, and precisely where this investigation goes next: how the Stoic elite operationalized the system under real pressure. There is a significant gap between understanding a principle and having built a structure that executes it automatically when you are under maximum cognitive load. Marcus Aurelius understood this gap better than any leadership theorist you will find on a modern business school syllabus. And the way he closed that gap is worth examining in granular detail, because the architecture he used translates directly into the environment you are navigating today. Every morning, before engaging with the demands of the empire, Marcus Aurelius ran what we can describe as a reality calibration protocol. 3 precise cognitive movements, executed in sequence, before any external input was processed. The first movement was obstacle anticipation. Not avoidance, anticipation. He would name, explicitly, the categories of difficulty he expected to encounter that day. The meditations record this in striking directness. Today, we'll meet ungrateful people, arrogant people, dishonest people. This reads as pessimism to an untrained eye. To a cognitive engineer, his expectation architecture. When the obstacle was pre-named, the mind could not be hijacked by surprise. The energy that would have been consumed by shock and indignation was preserved entirely for the quality of the response. In the language of modern performance psychology, he was eliminating the emotional tax of novelty before it could be charged. The second movement was the return to what is essential. A single ruthless question: what is actually at stake here? Not what appears to be at stake. Not what the political narrative says is at stake. What is real, verifiable, and connected to the principles he had chosen to govern his behavior. This movement operated like a signal filter, cutting through the noise with surgical efficiency and directing full cognitive resources to the signal that mattered. The third movement was the most counterintuitive, and likely the most powerful. He practiced active indifference to outcome, not apathy, active indifference. His focus was directed entirely at the quality of the process, at the integrity of the action in the present moment, completely decoupled from the need for a specific result, for approval, for recognition. This separation of action from outcome is, in practical terms, the highest leverage mental technology the Stoics developed. It is also the direct opposite of what most high-performance environments reward and reinforce. Here's where the pattern interrupt matters. Consider that the most advanced artificial intelligence systems in 2025 are being designed with a remarkably similar architecture. Reinforcement learning models that perform best under uncertainty are precisely those that optimize for process quality rather than immediate reward signals. The engineers at the frontier of machine intelligence are, without always realizing it, rebuilding Marcus Aurelius. The operating system was correct 2,000 years ago. The technology has simply taken this long to confirm it. In the evenings, Marcus Aurelius closed the loop with a review protocol that was neither self-flagellation nor self-congratulation. It was data collection. What performed well today? Where did the system fail? What requires recalibration? A test pilot reviewing flight data after a difficult mission is not punishing himself for turbulence. He is extracting intelligence to make the next flight more precise. This is exactly the cognitive posture Marcus Aurelius maintained at the close of every day, regardless of whether that day had been a military victory or a catastrophic loss. If the depth of this architecture is resonating with you, connecting the thread here is worth doing. Now, every investigation in this series builds on the previous one, and what comes next in this sequence requires the foundation you are building right now. The emotional pivot. What this system reveals about the life you are actually living. Stop for a moment. Not to rest, to measure. You have just been shown the internal architecture of a man who governed 15% of the world's population, managed active military campaigns on multiple fronts, watched colleagues die from plague, and navigated political conspiracies that ended careers and lives with regularity. And in the middle of all of that, he maintained a level of mental clarity and philosophical discipline that scholars, generals, and CEOs have studied with reverence for centuries. Now, let your own situation with the same precision he would have applied to his. Not to minimize your pressure is real, but ask the question with complete honesty. How much of what is currently fragmenting your focus exists within your field of control, and how much of it is outside it? How much of your daily cognitive bandwidth is consumed by outcomes you cannot change, by other people's behavior, by uncertainties that no amount of attention will resolve before their time? The answer to that question, if you sit with it honestly, is almost certainly a number that would disturb Marcus Aurelius. Not because you are weak, because no one has ever handed you the sorting algorithm. The modern performance ecosystem gives you tools for doing more. It rarely gives you the architecture for perceiving correctly. And without the perceptual architecture, every tool you add to your system increases complexity without increasing clarity. You end up running more sophisticated operations on the wrong inputs. Here is the question that cuts through everything else. What would your professional output look like? What would your decision-making quality look like? What would your actual experience of your own life look like if you systematically stopped investing cognitive energy in what you cannot control? Not as a one-time exercise, as a trained, automatic reflex that runs before every significant decision, every high-stakes conversation, every moment of pressure. The Stoics would tell you that the answer to that question is not an aspiration. It is a diagnosis of exactly what you are leaving on the table every single day by operating without this architecture. And the gap between where you are and where you could be is not a gap of talent, effort, or intelligence. It is a gap of operating system. That gap is closable, but only if you stop filling it with more techniques and start building the foundation those techniques were always supposed to rest on. This act carries no requests, no asks. The work done in the last several minutes deserves to be received without interruption. Sit with the weight of what was just laid out. The next section translates everything into something you can begin building today, in the environment you actually live in, against the pressures you actually face. What if you ran this operating system starting tomorrow? The modern translation. The bridge between ancient architecture and modern execution is shorter than most people expect, and the reason it feels distant is not complexity. It is the assumption that a system designed for Roman emperors must require Roman-level resources to implement. It does not. What it requires is precision, consistency, and the willingness to treat your own mind as an instrument that can be deliberately calibrated, rather than a condition you simply experience. The first practical translation is what we can call the entry protocol. Before you open any application, before you check any message or feed, before external input defines the shape of your attention for the day, you execute a 2-minute cognitive triage. One question: what, within my direct field of control, constitutes the essential work of today? Not the urgent, the essential. That distinction, applied consistently over weeks, begins to physically reshape the circuits governing your attention. Neuroplasticity is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism by which this practice works. The second translation is the modern application of what Seneca called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Before any high-stakes engagement, before a difficult conversation, before a project that demands maximum cognitive output, you spend 60 seconds visualizing the most challenging plausible outcome, not the catastrophic fantasy, the difficult realistic. You build the mental response to that scenario before it arrives. The result is that when real pressure appears, and it rarely matches the severity of what you rehearsed, your nervous system has already processed that territory. There is no hijack. There is a response that was ready before it was needed. Special operations forces run this protocol before every mission. Elite surgeons run it before every complex procedure. Marcus Aurelius ran it before every day. The third translation is the evening calibration, a brief, data-oriented review of where your focus was invested and where it was lost. Not as self-judgment, as engineering intelligence. You are not looking for reasons to feel good or bad about the day. You are looking for the pattern in the data that tells you where the system requires adjustment. Over time, this practice builds a level of self-knowledge that no personality assessment or executive coach can manufacture. You become your own most precise diagnostician. What you now hold is not a collection of tips. It is a coherent operating system, one that was stress-tested in conditions that would collapse most modern frameworks before lunch, one that the highest performers in history have returned to repeatedly, across cultures and centuries, because it works not when conditions are favorable, but precisely when they are not. High performance at its core is not about doing more. It was never about that. It is about perceiving accurately, acting precisely, and releasing the rest with the discipline of someone who understands that control is a resource, and wasting it on what lies outside your field is the most expensive mistake a serious mind can make. This is where most investigations end. But what you have seen here is the entrance architecture of a system that goes considerably deeper. The Stoic operating system has layers that the practitioners themselves took years to fully map. The next investigation goes directly into one of those layers, specifically the one governing how the trained Stoic mind approached decisions with irreversible consequences, the kind of decisions that define careers, relationships, and legacies. If that territory is one you need to navigate with more precision, you already know what to do. And here is the question to carry with you. In the last 90 days, name one decision you made that was driven entirely by what was within your control, and one that was hijacked by what was not. Because the gap between those two answers is exactly the size of the operating system you are now building.